Welcome to the final talk in the Shehar series. The Shehar Conversation series explored different facets of life in small cities of India. The speakers engaged with aspects of urban growth, physical and cultural transformations of the cities, aspirations of the youth, and governance aspects and issues of social and segregation of different communities in the city. So a bit about the process of how we started. Basically, it all started with a little conversation with Abhijit Kapilish, the Commissioner Abohar MC. And the conversation really started with this possibility of hiring us as landscape designers for a new commercial center that was proposed in Abohar. But soon after we had a few conversations, it turned into a 9-month-long, still kind of ongoing process of inquiry into the social, ecological, personal, political landscapes of Abohar. We call this process Abohar Urban Studio, which essentially is a pedagogical approach to design and research. In all, we are 10 artists, architects, landscape architects, planners, anthropologists, geographers, and exploring this collectively. And of course, with the with the help of bureaucrats and local engineers and plumbers and numerous other workers on the ground, and of course the citizens of Abohar. So during this immersive, ethnographic study, we defined and redefined, the initial design briefs, that were given by Abhijit. And while trudging the landscapes of Abohar, and you'll be taken through this journey by others in the group in a while. This is a really short time we had. We felt, studies like this actually could span much longer. But in this time, we got really confronted with, the whole ungraspability of the situation. We even got repelled and agitated by what we saw. There was a series of entangled, harsh, dusty, dry, clogged situations, and Abohar being at the edge, quite literally. There were things that were really incomprehensible. But through this process, somehow, the process itself gave us that inspiration, and we kind of by and by connected to the place. And we all, I think I can say from everybody's behalf that we all found not only something personal in this journey, but a collective voice and a certain courage to, at least to challenge the standard practices of design, planning, and research. So some of the initial exercises, when we started, was really moving outside of our comfort zones. We started reading theories and literature from each other's disciplines. So the studio really became an active zone, where there's a lot of time that we spent discussing, really a space of care and creativity and critical thinking. And this is where we kind of got these insights, that unfolded and became, now some of them are recommendations that we can implement. So we are in the process of doing those, working drawings and reports. And the design outcomes are not really solutions, but collective response, like a trigger to further engage and connect with Abohar. And now we'll present, most of the people that will engage will present a short snippet of the process.
Yeah, so Abohar is a city on the border of Punjab. It's strategically located on the border of India and Pakistan, and it also shares borders with Rajasthan and Haryana, and the closest big cities being Sri Ganganagar in Rajasthan and Bhatinda in Punjab. And there are a lot of intercity flows among these cities because a lot of people travel for education, health, and business trips. So Abohar was introduced to us as the third dirtiest city of the country. In the below 10 lakh category, as you can see in this map, that Abohar stood at the third position. And that is why this infamous tag persuaded the citizens, politicians, and the bureaucracy into action. We encountered a city eagerly trying to get rid of this tag. Simultaneously, many areas in the city were inundated for several days during the monsoon of 2020. This made the dirtiness impossible to ignore. Whereas the report of the public health published in 1933 described Abohar as a small town, which is the most progressive in the province from the point of view of sanitation, as it possesses very good water supply and drainage works. Recalling these glamorous days of the city, one of the interlocutors illustrated, "Mashkon se naaliyan saaf hoti thi. Drains were cleaned continuously and regularly with height." Some others mentioned that in older times, Abohar was like mini Chandigarh. Then the question that arises is that how did this progressive village of Abohar become into the third dirtiest city of the country? So in trying to understand the trajectory of Abohar from the cleanest to the dirtiest settlement, we trace the socio-environmental history of the city within the specific social and political moments, drawing from the infrastructural turn in the social sciences that narrates the social life of a city through its material infrastructure. We tell the story of Abohar as intricately linked to the region, its ecology, and its infrastructures. Over to Sajal.
The story of habitation here can be traced back to the late Harappan period in 1900 to 1300 BC, as evident in the ASI protected monument called Mud Fort, an assemblage of crumbled mud walls, pieces of red earthen pottery, mud bricks, and pot shards. The structure exhibits the existence of once flourishing settlement that declined with the shift of the course of Satluj River. Ibn Battuta is believed to have transferred through this region in 1333. He described Abohar as the first of the cities of Hind. It is small, handsome, and thickly populated and possesses rivers and trees. Abohar's location along the trade route connecting Multan and Delhi made it significant stop. Later, around 18th to 19th century, colonial officials writing in the Gazette described this region as vastly uninhabited, and it was probably even more desert than it had been for many hundred years previously. Thickly covered with dense care and one shrubs, prairie fires were common in the region. By 1828, a Muslim clan called Sukhera came and settled to Abohar. They traded in cattle and ghee. The Britishers brought these waste dry tracts under their rule by the 1850s. Seeing its locational advantage along the trade route, they developed a mixed-use settlements in a square grid pattern. Abohar started becoming a center of trade and capital accumulation with the coming of canals and the railway lines by 1882. Rise in the agricultural economy of the region led to the construction of Kesarganj Mandi in 1897. The revenue from the Mandi in turn induced and organized urban development of the town. By 1929, the city had a well-functioning water supply and drainage system. Broadly speaking, introduction of water in the landscape led to urbanization of towns like Abohar. Along with mandis came a range of other formal and informal infrastructural investments in the form of roads, colonies, public amenities, etc. The town continued to thrive until 1940s. The drawing of the Red Cliff Line in 1947 shook the region. It is scarred with traumas of partition. For a brief period, being a Muslim-dominant region, Abohar and Fazilka were included in Pakistan. But eventually, the Satluj was viewed as a natural feature dividing two nations. Abohar became part of India. The entire Sukhera clan migrated to Pakistan. Over time, a new settlement or Nai Abadi was developed in Abohar to accommodate the refugees.
So despite these shocks, the city sustained owing to its well-established mandi with cotton as a major crop. The census of 1961 describes the city as well-planned and expanding fast. The city had 24-hour slow sand filtered water supply. The industrial sector of the city started growing with the establishment of Bhiwani cotton mills, as you can see in the slide, in 1957. followed by 10 to 12 others. A vibrant cotton industry brought prosperity to Abohar, leading to several investments in amenities, services, and infrastructures. Several labor colonies developed in the city to support the industrial economy. There were 2 cinema halls in the city, and it is said that movies used to be released in Bombay and Abohar on the same day. Abohar's urban facilities were updated at this time with specialized TB treatment centers, pipe water supply, the sewerage network, DAV college, and 2 research centers at Abohar, one for cotton and other for horticulture. The census of 1961 describes Abohar as secure for capital investment than the other nearer towns to Abohar, to the borders. By the 1970s, the region rose to political significance as it was hometown of the Lok Sabha Speaker late Balram Jhakar and an important location for the Indian National Congress of Punjab. In 1980s, as you can see in the slide, this is a snippet from a news article. In 1980s, a tussle between the state of Punjab and Haryana emerged over the inclusion of towns like Abohar and Fazilka, which are mostly Hindi-speaking towns in Haryana and Chandigarh in Punjab. But the then Chief Minister of Punjab in 1986 said, "We cannot once think of not taking Chandigarh, but we cannot give you Abohar." During our fieldwork in Abohar, we were often referred to as the team from Chandigarh. One of our intervention sites in old waterworks in the heart of the city. Built in 1929, this aging infrastructure is making way for a commercial center and city parks. Many of our debates and discussions revolved around the changing land use of this prominent area, around the auctioning of public land, and the need for urban commons. As you can see in the slide, the poster of Aba City Square is the auctioning of land in that area. Auctioning of shops, sale and purchase of properties, and the movements of goods at the mandi had historically generated revenue for the municipal committee and allowed for the maintenance of the infrastructure of the town. This urban governance practice of financing the city through auctioning of commercial land has continued. Its nature today is highly speculative and borrowed from neoliberal trends of urbanization.
मंडी से शहर और अब शहर से मंडी. This current perception of the city has emerged as one of the implications of the socio-political and ecological changes in the region. The colonial government ecologically transformed the landscape with the network of canals in order to ensure the supply of cotton and wheat to Britain. In the post-colonial period, the Indian state introduced green revolution technologies, which enhanced the production of high-yielding wheat and rice during the 60s and 70s. In the then state of Punjab. This replaced other types of wheat, pulses, and millets in most part of Punjab. But southwest Punjab was able to sustain cotton production in this early phase of the Green Revolution, owing to the complete dependency of farmers on the canals and the arid and semi-arid ecological conditions of the region. However, in the early 1980s, the attack of the bollworms and pests in the region affected the yield of cotton. The bollworm became a significant agent in paving the way towards the declining prosperity of Abohar. In the 1990s, waterlogging of the soil induced by the canals severely impacted the cultivation of cotton. In 1997, the introduction of free electricity for agriculture in Punjab and subsidies for deep tubewell irrigation provided technologies to the farmers of the southwestern Punjab to shift to paddy cultivation. Intersection of technocratic interventions, ecological transformations, and pests led to the decline of cultivation of traditional varieties of cotton in Abohar. To these list of reasons for the decline of cotton, some local farmers also added the distribution of fake BT cotton seeds and bad quality pesticides. Though the introduction of BT cotton increased the yield, the increase in cost of production and unreliable returns highly discouraged the farmers. The 1960s saw massive trade union strikes across the country, and Abohar too was not left untouched. Against these backdrops, Abohar saw the decline of the cotton industry, which not only led to closure of several mills in the city, but also stalled the urban growth of the city. The famous Bhiwani mills that shut in 1998, you can see the sale notice on the left side. The famous Bhiwani mills that shut in 1998 is where now a residential gated colony of Tara Estate is set up. The Abohar Cooperative Mill, over whose lands the new Mandi stands, closed in 2003. Many of these mills transformed into residential layouts or commercial layouts. The mill labor mostly came from UP, Bihar, and Rajasthan. Some of them went back to their native villages, while some families who stayed back in the city are now engaged in different forms of informal jobs, like vending, e-rickshaw driving, construction labor, farm labor, and Manrega labor. Now for the landowners searching for alternatives to cotton, quinoa farming emerged as one. As we all walked through the streets of Abohar, we could notice ruins of a once modern and well-planned town. Alongside, we also noticed signs of survival in the form of a small-scale jyoti making industry, tailoring units, molly making, and many other forms of home-based activities. We also saw the city's response to the Swachh Sarvekshan in the form of sewage pumping machines at work and cleaning campaigns throughout the city. Abohar's ability to absorb, adapt, and make alterations has sustained it through the series of political and ecological upheavals. It displays their continuous and emergent resilience. In our design of the Abha Square, we have consciously drawn flexible spaces that are sheltered and shaded to allow for vending, loitering, and other forms of fluid, spontaneous inhabitations, erupting alongside the more formal and rigid commercial blocks.
The decline of industrial sector of Abohar, which heavily relied on cotton cultivation, brought a wave of shock that affected the urban trajectory of the city. Abohar, which was once compared to Chandigarh, became the last town of Punjab and India. With this economic decline, Abohar became also invisible to the governance. Highlighting its invisibility, people described it as, इस शहर में दो तरह के लोग बहुत ज़्यादा है, नेता और दर्जी. Even then, we feel we are living in a lawarish shehar. We are living in an ignored city. Even the newspaper article on the screen is describing its invisibility and ignorance in the public and bureaucratic sphere. In another narrative, one other local describes, हमें सिर्फ रोड तक ही रखा. अब जब हम हर इलेक्शंस हम रोड ही मांगते रहेंगे तो बाकी चीजों के बारे में कैसे सोचे? पिछले 25 सालों से यही हाल है. So here the local is trying to explain us that we have been asking for roads since very long, and even that was not provided to us. So how can we think about different other facilities to demand from the government? So a mix of center-state politics and intrastate maneuvering sidelined Abohar within the Punjab's political landscape. The wear and tear of such tensions and friction started appearing on the urban landscape. The amenities of sanitation, entertainment, education, and health were not maintained. As we see it, after being the city of white gold, which is cotton, for some time, became a sink of all things unwanted and ignored. For example, we were very often told by the locals, there is a large population of bulls in the city. Due to various reasons like inefficiency and mechanization of agriculture, the bulls have been redundant in the agricultural landscape. While walking in Abohar, within every 100 meters, you will encounter a bull on the street. The fear of bulls emerged as one of the design problems for us, and we tried to engage with this issue through design of bollards and placing it in such a way that we could also encourage inclusivity and not inhibit people from entering into the public spaces. Abohar is experiencing a point of saturation, and quite literally, where its infrastructure appears to be completely clogged and crumbling. People have been expressing their anger and frustration in various forms. One of the clip art which you see on the left and on the side is kind of describing it, and I'll just play this video.
ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਹੋਰ ਵਾਸੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ. ਹਰਕਤਾਂ ਬੜੇ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਸੀ, ਪਰ ਅੱਜ ਅਫਸਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਲੀਡਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਦਿਲੋਂ ਬੇਇੱਜ਼ਤੀ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਮੂਡ ਬਣ ਗਿਆ. गौर नाल सुनियो, शेयर करियो. सियासतां ने देख लो की कीता हालिया, वाइट गोल्ड दा हब हो गया बेहालिया. लगे ना समझ लाल नीली बत्ती वाले, किहड़े हौसले ना फिरदे बनाउंदे टोर नूं. संग जही लगदी बगाने शहर जाके जदों दसदा मैं करदा वलोंग वोर नूं. संग जही लगदी बगाने शहर जाके जदों दसदा मैं करदा वलोंग वोर नूं. निकलो केरां तां लैके घरों बाहर गड्डियां, ਬੰਦ ਮੂੰਹਾਂ ਹੋਣੇ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਜੋ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਇੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਉਹ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਲਾਹਣਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਪਾਵਾਂ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਸਾਦਾ ਦੇ ਮਖੋਟਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲੁਕੇ ਚੋਰ ਨੂੰ ਸੰਗ ਜਹੀ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਬਗਾਨੇ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਦੱਸਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਵਲੋਂਗਾ ਵੋਰ ਨੂੰ ਬਦ ਕਿਸਮਤੀ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਆ ਸੀਵਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਪਾਣੀ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਛਿੱਟਿਆਂ ਨਾ ਮੂੰਹ ਤੇ ਕੋਲੋਂ ਲੰਘੀ ਕਾਰ ਤੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਲੈਨੇ ਆ ਲੈ ਕਿਸ਼ਤੀਆਂ ਵੇਚ ਬੰਬੂ ਕਾਟ ਸਬਸਿਡੀਆਂ ਦਵਾ ਦਿਓ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਤੋਂ ਉਹ ਸਬਸਿਡੀਆਂ ਦਵਾ ਦਿਓ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਰੂਹ ਕੱਢੇ ਵੋਟਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਗਾਲਾਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਮਾੜਿਆਂ ਹੱਥਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਡੋਰ ਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਬੜੀ ਸੰਗ ਜਹੀ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਆ ਬਗਾਨੇ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਦੱਸਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਵਲੋਂਗਾ ਵੋਰ ਨੂੰ ਜੇ ਮਾੜੀ ਮੋਟੀ ਅਣਖ ਜਾਗਦੀ ਹੋਵੇ ਤਾਂ ਸੰਭਾਲ ਲਿਓ
The local was trying to describe here how the ignorance of the politicians and the bureaucracy has made Abohar into in this degrading, converted Abohar into a degrading state, and the person feels ashamed when the person visits another city and says that I belong to Abohar. That is a point of shame for the person. To make sense of these ruptures emerging in Abohar, we are adapting water and infrastructure as our starting point of investigation. The fluidity of water here allows us to see various factors interacting with the city across various times and scales, but also provides an opportunity to engage with the materialities of the city, how the city feels or engages with the water socially through various everyday practices is the one provision which water provides us as a lens. In fact, two major sites of intervention in our design practice are also connected to this story. The old waterworks, which you have seen in the earlier slides, and the canal edge, which will be discussed further in the subsequent sections. In the following section, you will see how water has shaped and is shaped by the city through the canals, its topography, hydrology of the region, and the quality of water. We investigate how the inherent fluidities of water are acting back on the landscape and challenge the static structures of urban governance in Abohar.
Basically, really trying to understand the water dynamics that is happening in the city, we look beyond and through various layers of history, hydrology, and topography. So unlike the fertile loamy stretches of the northern and the central Punjab, Abohar, located in the southwestern parts of the state, had dry desert terrain with peripheries that is Kandyali Thor, locally known as, and the dust storms. So, however, the colonial administration brought water to transform these dry prairies into high revenue yielding land parcels with a web of canals in the 18th and 19th century. This colonial hydrology emphasized on increasing the flow of water for irrigation, but paid less attention to planning of the drainage out of the area it served. Escaping the channels, the water started percolating and interacting with the calcareous, clay and silty soil of the region. The sustained wetness in the soil brought through the canals in the semi-arid and arid zone in the southwestern became an ecological shock for the city. So the grandeur of these canals very soon was turned into the carrier of problems of waterlogging and salinity, and the embeddedness of these two dual problems in the society is expressed by the existence of the colonial term that is same. So this is an image which represents the salinity that is existing, and the soil, which the saline, the salts that appear on the soil, and the local people says diwaron par same chad jati hai. So that same travels from the ground to on the walls, and this is quite visible in the infrastructure. So the narrative we heard about the flow and movement of same from Malot, it travels from the Malot city that is in the northwest and towards towards Abohar in the south. So since the colonial times, the report and policies have focused on same as a problem or disease affecting agriculture and its economy. During the vertical movement, along with water, the same also carries salts and deposits it on the surface of the soil, which making it uncultivable. That is you can see on the screen. So next, zooming on to the city scale level. This map illustrates the model of the region, digital elevation, and this denotes the red color denotes the high region in the higher terrain and higher altitude, and whereas the blue are the lower lying areas. So we can the chappars, that are local water bodies that are mapped in blue, are represented in the map, and these these water bodies in the pace of urbanization and people building on highways and building. So these chappars were closed, and various like basically these chappars disappeared, and colonies were appeared, and so the water clogging occurred. So that there's an example of a chappar that is in Thakurabadi, and so the colony was cut, and this basically whole urbanization occurred, and the frequent flooding events, which you could see in the other slides. So this all occurred. So in Abohar, the groundwater depth in 1960 was about 80 feet, which was reduced to 11 feet in 1984. And it is currently like 3 to 4 feet at the points in the city. And in the conversation, locals in Abohar informed us that there was high water table in the region because of the same. So the city experienced flooding events frequently because of the changing ecology of the region. The fluctuating groundwater table with same also affects the reserves of the potable groundwater. But along with water and same, there are high quantities of fluorides and other salts in water. So it is basically the khara pani, the brackish water, they say locally. It is unfit for the consumption. The locals also brought several health issues like bone degradation, teeth problems, etc. to notice, caused by same in the city. So in addition, Abohar is also a part of infamous cancer belt of Punjab, which has a severe impact due to the green revolution.
Shailja has kind of described to you, three conditions, so to say, that are there in Abohar. The same, the quality of water, the chappars getting filled up. And Nitin also described to us the decline that came to the city. The decline, but along with it, the multiple small-scale economies and practices that continued to, keep the city afloat, despite all the political turmoil relating to shifting political boundaries, ecological shifts, economic shocks. So through the years, this, the neglect of the city has kind of been engaged. I mean, the city engages with, still kind of continues to provide for itself. And one of the ways that we engaged with the city was to unpack what these practices are that, keep the city going. And through the study of these practices, we find ways to deepen our understanding of it. So one of the practices that that we came across was the neighborhood RO shops and water tankers that supply RO water to homes. It's a delivery mechanism of a very basic necessity of drinking water, right? That goes to, that is within neighborhoods, and people actually buy drinking water or get tanks to deliver drinking water to their homes. And this came up because the residents could not trust the water supply for drinking. Further, the water supply in Abohar was known to come only 1 in 4 days. So another practice that we came across was that people built large storage tanks, filled large buckets in their homes, stored water to last them those 4 days. And for those people who had access to either the water department engineers, plumbers, or anybody with influence, try to ensure that they get more than one connection to their house so that they maximize the number of times water would be supplied to their homes through more than one connection. And when the same started interacting with these pipes, all the various water supply connections, and its salinity started corroding them, sewerage water mixed with sewerage, so the pipes started corroding, and then the sewerage water would mix with the water supply. And so then the residents found that they're receiving black water in their taps. And you know, this led to these puzzling situations for the plumbers where they're not able to figure out which connection actually has the black water. And in the same, like in one street, one house would have black water, but the rest of the street would not have that problem. So it became a very complex situation of pipes that were getting black water, but which house had, which house didn't, which connection brought what, was a very sort of confusing situation for everybody. This led to the practice of the governance, which we are calling a reverse mapping. The water team put together by the municipal commissioner showed us their practice of what we are of you know, an archaeological digging of the city at these critical junctures, to layer by layer figure out what is happening under the ground. What are the layers, the interventions, additions, repairs, alterations to these networks at key locations, and what are the stories that they really tell about what might have happened at the different points that the infrastructure was edited or added to or changed. And while they were doing this reverse mapping and trying to establish the situation, it was still a dynamic situation, because while they were doing this mapping, constantly the same was also interacting with the pipes, and the political negotiations also were continuously causing changes to the network. So I've talked to you about the water quality. I've talked to you about the same interacting with the infrastructure of the city. And the third thing that Shelja talked about was the urban flooding. And all the reasons as to why it happened. So a practice that we came across about the urban flooding was that an officer of the irrigation department described to us the interaction of at actually the rural urban interface at the northern edge of Abohar. He described how flooding in Abohar happens because the farmers in the neighboring villages channel the stormwater out from their fields towards the city. And at the highway's edge, they actually put together walls of sandbags to keep the water outside, like outside the city. And residential layouts on these outskirts of the city actually got flooded, and the water had to be drained out using massive pumps, dugout channels that transported the water all the way to the canal. All of these practices, you know, help us understand and engage with the design, with the design on the sites that we were actually intervening in. This is the old waterworks site that has been previously talked about. This is where the commercial complex Abohar City Square is made. So the way we kind of engage with rainwater management on this site comes from our larger understanding of what's happening in the city. We've been trying to reduce the pressures on the existing infrastructure for stormwater management, and instead trying to hold the water on these sites until the point that it can be, you know, put back onto the system. All these working drawings are all part of our engagement with the city of how we're trying to channelize that water and taking it to various holding points on the site. Like an example of this is what we're doing in the Abha Park, which is where we're making a seasonal pond where rainwater can be collected for a period of time, and then when it's not raining, it will kind of hold in the pond on the right side, on the top right side, and then in a dry season it could also be completely dry. So it shows this dynamic use of the site related to stormwater management. Prachi, who's a landscape architect based in Bangalore, is supporting us in all of these details of working out the landscape, slopes, swales, rainwater gardens, and other such details.
We've just heard a very interesting story of Abohar told through its infrastructure. And I want to kind of summarize some of that and ask a few questions of ourselves and of everybody who's here. One of the things is that in what way does this way of telling Abohar story inform urban theory and practice? As Jitesh also mentioned, the field for us was both pedagogical and a terrain for intervention. Inspired by those before us pushing for a situated form of engagement through what has been called Southern urban theory and practice, we went back and forth between drawing a line and walking the path, between concept building and praxis. The city forced us to challenge assumptions and norms that classify settlements into bounded units. The fortunes of Abohar have ebbed and have risen along with that of the surrounding rural areas. Looking from Abohar, we see that small town India is intricately connected to the regional rural and economic landscape. Scholars have long critiqued the rural-urban binary, and yet these binaries remain incredibly sticky, enough to impact governance. Abohar shows us how in particular ways local aspirations, regional politics, and ecologies and national upheavals shape and transform the rural-urban continuum. Paying attention to historical specificities, the Abohar emotion urged us to understand these categories as notional, dynamic, and relational. The same reminds us that towns are not two-dimensional territories contained neatly on flat maps and master plans. They are located amidst a regional topography that includes subterranean fluid landscapes, entangled networks of underground pipes, jumbled wires, dust storms, and pests. They are historically situated amidst legacy issues and aspirational futures that animate everyday life in the present, as demonstrated through the reverse mapping exercise that Apurva talked about, and the speculative urbanism that is unfolding that started unfolding with the closure of the mills and continues today with conversion of lands into plotted real estate developments, commercial centers, and so on. Metaphors that allowed us to think through the city with the city were words like sponge, sink, saturated. In a lot of our conversations, the notion of the fluid really dominated, and the fluid, not just in terms of the waterscapes that we spoke about, but fluidity in terms of how Abohar has coped with the several ecological and political shocks that it went through, how Abohar has stood the test of time, and how we see it as a resilient city that has weathered many, many storms, largely because it adapted and transformed. In other words, it was malleable. As we imagined the future for Abohar and with Abohar, it was essential for us to articulate our responses and our interventions as fluid and with flexibility. The Abohar Municipal Corporation had approached us with a view to propose design ideas for specific sites in the city. Our intention too was to gain a deep ethnographic understanding of the city that would lead to a historically situated, ecologically sensitive, and socially inclusive design. The rich and nuanced history and geography of the city that our study led us to, however, created more questions than it answered. Every line that we drew was fraught with contradictions. I mean, the kind of discussions and debates that we've had in the studio were quite intense. What does inclusion mean? Is public space to include or exclude the non-human? Do we ignore them in light of the ecological understandings that we have gained? How does one negotiate with the neoliberal aspirations that are coming from the city residents, even as we are aware of all the other complexities of the site? Does creation of an aestheticized environment require surveillance and control? Is it necessarily exclusive? How does one retain a fluidity in design and yet give exact specifications in the working drawings? A lot of tensions, contradictions, and we could have kind of, probably the process, they were as intense, could have probably stalled. But instead of being paralyzed by these questions, we chose to act with an understanding that design is but one point in the spatial evolution of a city. Design, as we see it, is a prompt. It will necessarily be taken over, tampered with, decorated, and dismantled by all those who inhabit the city, the human and the ecological. In this very intense engagement, many have participated in the dialogue. As you see, it's been a collaboration between Abohar Urban Fellowship, ISER Mohali, Studio Oriole, Municipal Corporation Abohar, Prachi from COUP, the city itself, and Manrega. So at this point, we have Mr. Abhijit Kaplish with us in the studio, and we would like to end the presentation with a few words by him. So Abhijit, if you can.
So yeah, the project began when we started thinking about a design proposal for the old waterworks city, and the question at that point was that should design be done in an isolation, or should it be accompanied by a multifarious research which brings in people from different backgrounds and studies different aspects of a city and the people who live in it before we finally start engaging with what should we intervene with. And while both the things went on together, the research into how people in the city live and how the city behaves infrastructurally and otherwise with them, the design element also parallelly grew. But what I learned in this process personally, it was supposed to be a pedagogical exercise for the fellows and really not for me. But I think it turned out to be a pedagogical exercise for everybody. And what I learned as a practitioner of administration is that this is probably the best way in which we should administer our cities or villages or whatever we do, because the group, it was a group that came in from all across India. It was a group with different backgrounds. It was a group in which different people had different qualities. It was a nice mix of gender as well, a nice mix of age groups as well. And hence the group was able to actually enter into the city and became almost invisible. It wasn't an obtrusive group. And they were able to engage with the citizens of the city, look at the history of the city, the geography of the city, and the different aspects of the sociology, the economics, and really the detail that they went in was beyond what I had expected. And there were times when I thought that would this kind of research be needed in a design that we are trying to do. But what I've learned in this entire process is that it's not the ends really which mattered. Urban practice probably should be like this. It should be more holistic than it is right now. It should be more democratic than it is right now. And it should be more based on research and inclusiveness of thought than it is right now. So I think that's my takeaway from this. And I'd like to thank everyone for this and pass on to Shilpa.
Thank you everyone for listening patiently to us. We are now open to questions. All of us here are in the studio, and we will be we are really excited to listen to your thoughts and your feedback.
Renuka has her hand up. Renuka.
Great. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the team. I think you've done a wonderful job, very explorative, very different, and very meaningful. And fascinating to hear how you've gone about it. I'm a gender practitioner, and what I was wondering, a couple of things which I thought maybe, if you could give me some information on, it'll help me understand the situation better. One was, I see that you have taken the economic perspectives, the ecology, you've brought that all into your study. I was just wondering about the politics, because I do know that, I have family in Abohar, and historically, one has always thought that Abohar, Fazilka were supposed to be part of Haryana. They were part of the Sirsa, spacing and their culture, and they belong to that portion of Haryana. At least many of their practices were linked to Haryana and the Jats. That's where you have even the Jakhar family also belongs to the Jats, and there have been a lot of political exchange between Abohar, Fazilka, and its positioning in Punjab. So I was just wondering how much of politics has played out in terms of segregating or making Abohar invisible, underdeveloped, because I think it is a very much a Hindu majority area. Largely Hindu majority doesn't fit into much of the dynamics and the growth of Punjab. So that was I just wanted to know that one issue. And second thing, I'd be fascinated to know how gender has played out in many of these issues. Very interesting to see how the historical colonial legacy impacted on its growth, on the farmers' issues and the rural urban, but just wanted to know how gender has played out. Thanks.
Thanks, Renuka. Yeah, very pertinent questions. In fact, just as we stepped in to Abohar, a lot of these politics also became very clear to us. And like we mentioned in the presentation, Abohar has kind of been witness to both, politics in terms of the partition, but also post-partition in terms of being the center for, it's been a very prominent place with the Jharkhand family resigning there for the Congress party. And currently, in fact, it's very interesting in terms of the infrastructural story also. Between the mayor and the MLA, the mayor is, I think, Congress, and the MLA is BJP. The whole tensions between different political parties play out in terms of who gets financing, does it get finances. So all of that, those stories came up quite a bit in even the contemporary scenario. And very interestingly, in some ways, this project has also unfolded at a very critical time in Punjab, with the elections coming up and the beautification of this previously somewhat ignored place. So these were some of the narratives we came up. I mean, and of course, there's a whole. This could be a whole different presentation also that we could sit and talk about. But yeah, it has had a complex political history. In terms of the gender question, that was another of the aspects that we engaged with, including So what I'll do is I'll just talk about briefly in terms of how we engaged with gender in the design process, for example. After speaking with several residents, a few of the things that came up was that, I'll name one, for example, very mundane infrastructural question related to gender, and that was of public toilets. The Abohar MC has already kind of started putting up toilets at several places. And what we wanted to do was make them highly prominent. So in the kind of designs that we have done, and this came up out of interviews which said that, like people who are, let's say, who have access to a car or are well off can easily rush back to their home when they want to go use a toilet. But women who are, let's say, vending or working class don't have access to public toilets as infrastructures. And we tried to kind of really emphasize in our design, like make toilets in some ways the central part of what we are trying to do. And there's several other things that we did to address questions of inclusion. We are also working with a local NGO called the Robin Hood Army, which is led by a young woman, Megha. So there two questions of class, gender come in terms of mainly access to public space, safety in public transportation, passing by thekas, and access to parks, access to leisure spaces. So yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that have come up, and but we can talk more later on these also. I already see that couple of other hands up. Mukta and then Surajit.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this presentation. So it was really, I mean, it really took us into the space and sort of made me feel like, oh, now I want to visit and see it for myself. So I really like the way everyone, spoke about different things and the way it came together. So thank you very much for that. I was intrigued by the question of resilience that you brought up, in the sense of the adaptability and malleability that was talked about. And so two questions on that. First of all, where is it coming from? I mean, who is responsible, or who's contributing to this form of resilience? Are there state institutions sort of engaged in that process, or is it entirely like a bottom-up, people-driven sort of resilience, which comes from what else can we do but be malleable, and but because we have to survive? Which then sort of leads me to that question of who's invested in the future of Abohar. So, I mean, I know it's an abstract question, but it's really coming from a place where, you are in a part of country where out-migration is a big conversation. You are in small towns are not necessarily seen as places of aspiration for young people. So who are these people who are going to invest in the long term? And a sort of slightly related question was when you're talking about Abohar's embeddedness in the agrarian regional landscape. I didn't get a very good sense of that, except for the part when you talked about farmers releasing the water back into suburban spaces. I didn't get a very good sense of what those interlinkages were, and is that the rural elite sort of back invested in Abohar in some way, or have the histories been peculiar enough that, you know, the Abohar is actually an urban community of certain people, traders, etc., who may not have that kind of connection. So it's linked to the previous question, but the essential question I'm trying to answer is, how do we go forward? Is this resilience and bottom-up resilience just a way of somehow making do because you're invested there and you don't have anywhere to go, or is there a way to actually leverage that towards something better? So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I'll just start answering and then others can kind of fade in. So yeah, I think it's the second thing you said, which is that this is what we have and this is what we kind of can make do with, and therefore you know, like there's no drinking water, so and an economy of these RO shops come up, but you know, there's no water supply every day, so you just kind of try to store it for as long as you can, or and things like that. And I think the connections that you've kind of made over the three questions or the three sort of observations is pretty much what our kind of trajectory of understanding this has been, that the population that is actually living in the city may not actually have that kind of influence, or that their interests are actually within the city, but the power actually lies outside. And so then the highways are, of course, very you know, really well made. The people are living in Abohar, but they also have houses in Chandigarh or elsewhere. And so there isn't actually too much interest within the city to, you know, keep it alive and to keep investing in it. But of course, we're seeing a change now. So like in the current scenario, there is a lot that's being done in the city. So something in the political kind of arena has changed, or is at this moment has a window in which investment is happening in the city. So I mean, yeah,
I think some of it might have to do with the crisis, you know, the recent crisis of, you know, Abohar being labeled as the dirtiest city, and then COVID. I think, you know, this group that Anu was talking about, you know, really came together during COVID, and I think it's and I think the politicians woke up also, you know, with these situations, with these crisis situations. But I think Vijit will have a
yeah. So I think I have a couple of points to keep. I think number one, as far as resilience is concerned, that's been something that I have also always asked of myself, and I have always asked people of the city as well, कि यार मतलब आप कैसे रह रहे थे यहाँ पे, आप क्यों रहते रहे? और a couple of things that have come out is that Abohar has had some or the other fortune of accidental fortune, if I may call it, because Kinu, for example, was something that people were not expecting, but because of Kinu, the economy really just kept going. And if you're invested in the area around, you can't live anywhere else but the city. Similarly, you know, for example, politically also the city has been in the mainstream of at least the Punjab Congress Party, and hence has always gotten some funds or something like that. So none of this was planned by the people, but I think somewhere or the other, all of these things did come into play. Another thing is that the areas around Abohar are vast areas. This used to be what is typically called a Maruthal area. And now, because it is not Maruthal, so the typical ceiling norms do not apply. And hence the average landlord is wealthier than the average landlord of Punjab. And again, another reason why decently wealthy people actually continue to live here. I have personally known people who've studied from, let's say, Doon School or Lawrence School in Sonawar and places like that, Bishop Cotton and whatnot, and have come back and staying in Abohar. But another thing which I think from a theory point of view may not be very relevant, but one thing that I've observed is that aesthetics and beauty and pride in them also has something to do with the resilience, because this city used to be a very beautiful city. This was a city that people took pride in. And I think there's again where design comes in, because right now what we are doing, if we are able to do something so beautiful that people actually take pride in it, then I think some amount of ownership will arise. To the second question as to who is invested in the city really, I think that is a question for all of us. In fact, a member of the Jakar family, we've spoken about them so many times, very recently asked me कि अभिजीत जी हमारे शहर का बनेगा क्या अगले 25-30 साल बाद. And so what I've been proposing is that if time permits, we can probably have a in-house conference here there in Abohar to know as to what people can come in from across the spectrum, and then we can talk maybe on a 2-day forum as to what will happen, because the Shehar series could end on that note too, as to what will happen to these smaller cities and where do people expect them to go, or maybe scenario planning or something like that. But I think that is part of what, as Dr. Sablok said in the beginning, that this has thrown more questions than given answers. So I think the second question as to iska shehar ka hoga kya is a very big question. I think that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah, hi. This is Shurajit, and I'm representing the School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. Firstly, let me congratulate you for this wonderful, wonderful project. I mean, and the insightful presentation that went with it. It's inspiring, and it's, you know, it's more when more of us do these kinds of you know, engage studies in communities. That's, I think, the way to reform the planning process in general. That's how it will become mainstream. That's when local governments will realize that this is the way it's really supposed to be done. So congratulations on all of that, and well done. The question I want to probe a little bit is about participation. Of course, your whole, you know, theme is participation and getting to know people. But again, participation by itself is not a new idea. That we should talk to people when we plan is by itself not a new idea, although I take your point that it's not mainstream in planning institutions in India yet. However, where the part that's still challenging not only you know, planners in India but around the world is, how do we make the design process itself participatory? So not just study them as subjects, then bring our information to the design table and then we specialists design. How do we get them involved? And this is not an easy process. I'm not saying it is easy by any stretch. So I want to know whether you were able to, you know, get towards that goal, or whether it generated some insights on this question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Surajit. Very, very pertinent question. This is something that we have been grappling with since like day one. I mean, in some ways, I wouldn't say that our central point is that participation is key. I think the point that we really learned through this process was that design, of course, it needs to be participatory and it needs to be collaborative, but it also needs to be fluid. It needs to allow for changes, and it needs to kind of need to know when to give up, and you need to know where to kind of you know, insist. So some of these very subtle things that came across. In terms of participation, also the key question for us, for example, is participation with whom, collaboration with whom, you know, whose voices get to the table, and at what point. So obviously there would be field work, and there would be inputs from several across the different stakeholders. And at the final stages, then ultimately it's that one line or whatever that we draw that ends up becoming a working drawing, that ends up being tendered out, that ends up with a contractor who's going to build it. So those were some of the very you know, the very contradictions that we kind of tried to work with. And yes, I mean, on the one hand, it eventually is a process that is going to have a very concrete output. And the output itself at some point stops becoming participatory from a very expansive point of view, and yet it remains participatory because from day one, let's say, so those who will be involved in this, the shopkeepers, the municipal engineers, the plumbers, those have been like with us from pretty much the beginning, and there have been many. In fact, many of them have challenged us, and many at times we have challenged them. And what has emerged out of a dialogue. So that's kind of the extent of the participation or the collaboration, I would say, that we have been able to do. Of course, there's a long way to go. And Richa wants to say something.
So
Thank you.
one of the examples of this, like we collaborated with all the engineers and throughout this 9 months of time. So after that, usually what we see is ki, even after community engagement, the design is still an alien thing to the users. But then one of the engineers, and who is also user of the city, said that आपके साथ रह के ये तो पता चल गया कि पहला हक पेडेस्ट्रियन का है स्ट्रीट्स पर. और इवन आपके जो हमने like we with this collaboration process, we got involved with the Manrega labor, and we built some Ramdars benches. So they were like, ये तो बहुत अच्छा है, ये locally सब कुछ बन गया. So also in that process, we learned each other's values and कि क्या अच्छा है and क्या नहीं. So that kind of engagement.
Any other questions, thoughts?
I have a comment or maybe a little question. So I had a more limited understanding of inclusivity and what it may mean in a city, and it was interesting to hear about the the non-human elements like the animals and how they fit in and how they may be included. So if you can talk a little more about that.
Thank you for that question. Like the question of the bulls, the example which I gave in the presentation, that we have been, every visit we have been sort of in our field work, we have been bombarded with the question कि आप कुछ भी करके यहाँ पे बाउंड्री वॉल खड़ी करो ताकि बुल्स या कैटल ना आ पाए कोई भी साइड के अंदर. And there's a safety from the stray cattle in the city. But we also thought that they also need space because they have been also left into the city by the farmers in the bigger dynamic situation of the region. So we have sort of created these spaces or left out these spaces intentionally so that the non-human beings can sort of take over and shape the space, the pedestrians, the pathways in the way they want to. Do you want to add?
Basically, जो जैसे हमारे पास सामने एक बुल्स को रोकने के लिए हमने सब जगह बोलार्ड्स नहीं, उसकी जगह कुछ प्लांटर्स और ऐसे एलिमेंट्स ऐड किए कि नहीं वो एकदम ऐसे ब्लॉक नहीं करने चाहिए आपको, वो प्लांटर्स और बोलार्ड्स आपको इनवाइट भी करें बेसिकली. और कुछ ऐसे एलिमेंट ऐसे ट्रीज और ऐसे उन सबको मतलब एक लैंडस्केप के अंदर मर्ज करते हुए एक इनवाइटिंग सा पूरा एक स्पेस क्रिएट किया, एक इन्वायरमेंट बेसिकली क्रिएट किया है rather than basic a design.
Thank you, Harsha, for the question. Regarding the caste composition, majorly Jat and the Khatri community are the dominant caste in the city. And they are majorly Hindi speaking in the state of Punjab. That belt is majorly of Hindi speaking communities. The major Muslim clan, the Sukhera clan, they had moved to Pakistan after the partition. The dominant caste is Jats, and the other the sort of influence comes from Rajasthan. People who speak Bagri, they are the other community who are sort of, they have moved here from Rajasthan region to this region. And there's also some bit of influence from Haryana also. I think the first question Renuka asked about how this politics of how initially the Abohar was part of Haryana in Sisal district, and then it was part of the Punjab, and also it is influenced from all these neighboring states, neighboring regions.
And so the domination is coming from, that's the trading community in this city.
To add to what Shilpa is saying, there's also a number of like a quantity of population of the Valmiki community, which sort of engage in a lot of these small scale industries. They're doing the jutti making. They are working with leather. They're working with let's say the embroidery that happens on the juttis. So a lot of this population moved in from other areas and settled around this region. So that also forms the caste. That's a part of the caste dynamic in the region.
There's one more question. To what extent can the proposed plan utilize the water for the ecology?
I can begin and then others can pitch in. So there's a question about how much of water we are absorbing or using in the projects. So the project really started, with these sites, where we had to do these interventions, and plus some of these observations that we had, like what Shelja and Apurva talked about, the chappers and the periphery areas. So obviously it was not within this time span, and with our kind of in a way scope, we couldn't really do this comprehensively. The idea of using blue-green infrastructures, for example, in solving or in integrating with the with your regular, let's say, harder infrastructures is the, that was kind of the line of thinking that we took. And for example, the Abha Park, the interventions that we see, so it's not just taking care of the water that's just falling in the Abha Park. We are trying to collect the water that's coming from upstream from the roads and trying to create a sort of a sponge kind of a landscape where it can definitely offset, some of these, the usage of the sewage system. So yeah, but it remains a question of how much, I don't know, we can quantify it or put a number to it, but our idea was to sort of look at the context around.
Add to that, the Aba City Square site, initially it was a waterworks site. So it had these huge ponds which used to hold water. And sort of it was already a porous landscape which was existing in the center of the city, was absorbing water and holding water of that watershed of the city. So we're trying to retain that sort of its function in some sense, function, lack of the word, for a better word, are you using function? So to sort of retain that sponge-like porous landscape which are already existing there, to sort of overlay on this new commercial land use which will be introduced in this landscape.
Yeah. Any suggestions, any thoughts as we move forward? We still have a month to make corrections, I guess. Wrap it up and kind of, although I think we will now forever remain connected to the city of Abohar. But yeah. So if not, thank you very much to everyone who joined us in this journey today. And we look forward to hearing from you later also. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.